Ecofeminism is often thought as the connection between women and nature. However, Cynthia Billy points out in her essay, Yellow Woman is Ecofeminist, that ecofeminism is about much more than identifying this connection between women and nature. What ecofeminism is really about is understanding women's oppression and nature's oppression, and how we can only truly understand the oppression of both of these by how they intersect. Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffins, and Helen Tiffin in Post-Colonial Studies, The Key Concepts, define ecofeminism as the indissoluble connectedness, both physical and conceptual, of the earth itself and all life on it. With this definition, we can see that ecofeminism is about more than just pointing out the connection between women and nature, and what it is truly about is pointing out the connection between all people and nature. Ecofeminism is about the dissolving of the human versus nature binary, and consequently, all the binaries that the human versus nature binary sets up. Western Enlightenment rational thinking links a furthering from nature with progress, meaning that the less humans involve themselves with nature, the more civilized they become. Therefore, because women are viewed as more closely related to nature than men, women, and any people that align themselves more with their environment, are seen as less human. Val Plumwood, in her essay, Nature, Self, and Gender, Feminism, Environmental Philosophy, and the Critique of Rationalism, shows that qualities such as rationality, freedom, and the transcendence of the material sphere are seen as masculine qualities. They are aligned with the human side of the human versus nature binary and therefore seen as superior. And qualities such as reproductivity, sensuality, and emotionality are seen as feminine qualities and are therefore aligned with the nature and inferior side of the binary. Val Plumwood sets up this connection between the human versus nature binary and the male versus female binary, where human relates to male and nature relates to female. I would like to add one more layer to this binary, where we see colonized relating to the human and masculine side of the binary, and we see not colonized relating to the nature and feminine side of the binary. So we can see that not colonized is the inferior choice when we have these setups of the binaries. In the three texts that I proposed for students of the EWL 120, there is a female character that attempts to navigate her place in these binaries and realizes that she does not fit neatly into either side. This inability to be confined to either side of the binary results in an ambivalence, where the women in these texts are both attracted to and repulsed by their post-colonial identities. This definition of ambivalence was adopted into post-colonial theory by Homi Bhabha. However, to narrow the lens of ambivalence, I would like to examine these texts through the idea of the uncanny in post-colonialism. This idea was proposed by Pramod Nayar in his essay, The Post-Colonial Uncanny, The Politics of Dispossession in Amartya Ghosh's The Hungry Tide. To define uncanny, we look to Freud. The uncanny is the human sense of house and home. It is a perception of space where the perceiver finds herself simultaneously at home and not at home. Through ambivalence and the uncanny, we can see how a colonial subject would be attracted and repulsed by their home at the same time. Whereas a colonial subject may have physically lived in the same geographic area before, during, and after colonization, once colonization begins, that geographic area is no longer the home they knew. European ideas and rationalities are forced upon them in that space that was once unquestionably home and creates an uncanny. In Leslie Marmon Silko's The Yellow Woman, the narrator does not feel at home in her westernized, colonized life as a wife and mother. Therefore, she runs away with Silva, and when she is with him, she contemplates the idea that she could possibly be the Yellow Woman, the subject of the stories that her grandfather used to tell her. However, whenever she is with Silva and contemplating that she could be the Yellow Woman, she immediately dismisses this as completely impossible. She could not be the Yellow Woman. Those stories were archaic and unrealistic. Therefore, she does not feel at home with Silva either. However, she recognizes that the only time she ever feels a deep connection with something is when she is in nature, mostly interacting with Silva's horses. When the narrator discovers that Silva has been stealing and selling cattle, She returns back to the reservation and her life as a westernized, colonized wife and mother. However, she realizes that she is not at home there once again. Here we have the uncanniness. When she is at home on the reservation with her family, she feels that she does not belong and wishes that she could be more connected with nature. So, when she escapes with Silva, she feels that she could possibly be the Yellow Woman, but she does not feel at home in that setting either, because she cannot contemplate the true reality of being the Yellow Woman. Her identity lies somewhere between the two, but because of the stark binaries that have been set up for her, she cannot navigate where she truly belongs. The Yellow Woman attempts to dissolve these binaries by breaking the human versus nature binary and the colonized versus not colonized binary. However, the gap between the two is just too wide for her to bridge herself. Similarly, in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Wedding at the Cross, we see how Mirimu navigates this gap, but in two phases. At first, she falls in love with Wirayuki, a rebel, who is very good at towing the line between mimicry and mockery. Mirimu has been brought up as a Christian colonized subject, and by marrying Wirayuki, it is a stance against her upbringing. She runs away with Wirayuki, but not before her father can express his deep disappointment in Mirimu's decision in a husband. This disappointment has a deep effect on Wirayuki, and he therefore does a complete 180 identity change, where he becomes the colonized and Christian subject that he often mocked. Here starts phase 2 of Mirimu's uncanniness. At first, she attempts to remedy her uncanniness by running away with Wirayuki in an attempt to feel as if she is more connected to her pre-colonial identity. However, once Wirayuki becomes Dodge W. Livingston Jr., just a carbon copy of her father, she seeks solace in the religion of sorrows, whose drumming and shouting remind her of the first days with Wirayuki. Ultimately, Mirimu decides that she cannot marry Dodge W. Livingston Jr. at a wedding at the cross because she was already married to his previous self. Here again, Mirimu is attempting to dissolve the difference between human and nature and colonized and not colonized, knowing that her identity lies somewhere between the two. These two stories alone show how detrimental these binaries can be. Each woman attempts to shorten the gap between human and nature and colonized and not colonized in order to remedy their uncanniness. However, as I mentioned in The Yellow Woman, the gap is just too big for either woman to bridge herself, resulting in a persistent feeling of not at home uncanniness. However, in Amativ Ghosh's The Hungry Tide, we see how his main character, Paya, has some success in bridging the gap between human and nature and colonized and not colonized. Paya is an American of Indian descent who is in the tide country of Bangladesh studying dolphins. Her studies bring her to meet a fisherman, Fakur, who is a native of the tide country. Paya is surprised by the ease with which their work intersect despite their seeming dissimilarities. Paya feels the uncanny in that she is in the country that she was born in and she is studying a species that is native to the land, but she is unable to truly learn and know the land in the way that Fakur is. Only Fakur knows the tide country, and he only knows it because he realizes that it is not just a landscape to learn and memorize, but an environment with which you need to experience. Paya learns how to experience the tide country from Fakur, and is able to share the knowledge by creating a database after his death. In this way, Paya combats her uncanny by shortening the gap between human and nature by learning how to experience the tide country from Fakur. She is able to translate his native knowledge into a database and therefore bridges the gap between colonized and uncolonized. Each of these women attempts to bridge the gap between human and nature, masculine and feminine, and colonized and not colonized. Each woman realizes that their identity does not lie in one side of each of these binaries, but rather somewhere in the middle. The only way to truly understand each of these oppressions is to understand how they interact, meaning that to understand how the oppression of women relates to the oppression of nature and the oppression of the not colonized, we must understand that they all intersect. And therefore, we must combat them by dismantling the idea that they are somehow separate from the human, masculine, and colonized end of the binary. Just as Cynthia Billy points out, that ecofeminism is not just about identifying that women and nature are somehow connected, but by understanding that the oppressions intersect. I say that the only way to combat the oppression of women, nature, and not colonized is to understand how they intersect and dismantle the binary as one.